moving to the speaker, so let me just introduce something about housekeeping. All attendees are requested to be on mute. So if you have any questions, you can type in the chat box. So anyways, after the end of the session, we'll be taking question answers. And if at all, if you're facing any technical glitch, you may try exiting and rejoining again. Just introduction about Datacode. I'll keep it brief. Datacode is a leading organization in the field of geoscience industry, and it has been providing cutting-edge technology and services to industry, and it has been in the market for more than 25 years. The three E's that we believe in is empowerment of our end users, enhancement of employee skill set, and equity to all stakeholders. So this partnering progress we have started since 5 months back, and we have been bringing all resource persons. The objective of this partnering progress is to share knowledge within the community, within the geoscience community, I would rather say, for better reach of the subjects. And we try to bring eminent speakers from the field of geoscience, wherein they can share their subject knowledge, they can share the work that they have done, and so that they can increase the knowledge of all the people who are listening, and also the future. Even so, it's also who should attend. It's also for the students who would be passing out, and all the professionals from this industry. The main goal from this partnering progress is to empower the knowledge, be it students and professionals from the industry, and create a wealth of knowledge for the society at large. So without taking much time, let me just quickly introduce our today's speaker, Mr. James Reid. He has done BSc and MSc degree in geophysics from the University of Sydney. Also, he has done PhD in geophysics from Macquarie University. He has served as ASEG president from 2006 to 2007, and since 2012, he has been principal consultant with Mira Geoscience in Perth, and currently he is the director for Mira Geoscience Asia Pacific. He previously held positions with the University of Tasmania, Geoforce, and Ground Probe Geophysics. His main technical interest are applications of airborne electromagnetic methods to mineral and groundwater exploration, and integrated interpretation of multidisciplinary geoscientific data. So, Dr. James, I won't take much time. I'll hand over it to you. Maybe if you can introduce yourself more, if at all, please. So, you're almost to you. Please.
Okay, I'll just share my screen and just make sure what I've got on it. Okay. So I'll just. So thank you everyone for attending, and thanks to Datacode for the opportunity to present today. It's you know, an audience we might not usually see, so I think you guys sound like you have quite a range of backgrounds, so that's you know, it's great to be able to present to you, and I hope you find it interesting. I don't think I need any more introduction. I think that was everything I could think of when I wrote that biography, so I'll leave it there. But I have been a principal consultant with Mira Geoscience since 2012, and increasingly we're doing more and more of this integrated interpretation work, where we're getting lots of different data together and using it to make exploration decisions. And Datacode are one of our software resellers worldwide, so that's where the association comes from. So just a quick outline of this talk. Yeah, someone's microphone isn't muted, so just a quick outline of this talk. I'll just talk about the various steps of integrated interpretation, what we call integrated interpretation, 3D compilation, development of a cover model, establishing the relationships between the geophysical responses and geology, and then interpretation and both sort of conventional interpretation and then geologically constrained 3D inversion. Oops, sorry about that. And then targeting, which is what we often use the final model for. So the whole the whole idea of integrated interpretation is to try and develop a 3D model which is consistent with all your geoscientific data at the scale that you've chosen to work. So it could be done at a very local scale or a regional scale. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of interpretation doesn't make proper use of all the 3D information that's available in the geophysics, and that often people are looking at plan views of magnetic data and drawing lines on them, and that's the full extent of the interpretation. And this is talking about taking the geophysical data and extracting as much three-dimensional information from it as we can. We do this kind of work with a multidisciplinary team. You need a multidisciplinary team to do it, of geologists, geophysicists and geochemists. And I guess one of the tricky points about this kind of work, this 3D model building, is that the hard geological information tends to be concentrated around the mineralization, and we don't have much information on petrophysics and things necessarily of the country rocks or sometimes even the host rocks. But the issue there is that geophysics is really the only way we have of doing a volumetric interpretation away from drilling. So once we build the model, it forms a framework for more detailed exploration. And we also use it for numerical targeting. So this just shows the typical sort of drilling scenario. This is a 3D seismic survey from a gold mine in Western Australia, and just showing that in this seismic cube, which is this, you can see my mouse, which is the area of interest, this seismic cube here. No prizes for guessing where the deposit is in this area. It's where all these drill holes are, and there's a real lack of drilling away from the deposit and to any reasonable depth. So all the deep drill holes are down here where the mineralization is. So this is a very typical scenario for when you come to do this integrated interpretation work. So the first step in the interpretation is just a 3D compilation, which is getting all your data together in a software package that can, import all these different kinds of geoscientific data. So we use GoCAD because we develop software for GoCAD, but there are other software packages around that will do a similar job. But when you're compiling the data, then also quality controlling it as bringing it in is a very important step. So things like often mine sites will come to us and they have data in a mixture of mine grid and UTM coordinates. Data might be referred to different elevation models, or things might drill holes might have been drilled before the open pit was dug or something like that, and they're sitting up in the air now. And it's very important, as one example, to make sure all your data is correctly placed relative to the DEM, and that you have a common, DEM is digital elevation model, that you have a common digital elevation model for all your observations. So it turns out many clients that we work for have never seen all their data together in a single project. It's probably becoming less common now, but some we've had clients in the past that have had where the mines have been running for decades and they've never seen all their data together. They've acquired a lot of surveys over that time, but each one has been interpreted individually without reference to all the other data around it. So that even that compilation step and putting everything together in a single platform can give immediate exploration insights. So one thing we do very early on in the process, certainly in Australia, is to develop a cover model, and that's really a base of weathering surface or top of fresh rock, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes, depending on the data that you have, it may be possible to distinguish transported cover from in situ weathering, and so that will be of variable importance around the world, and what people call cover in different parts of the world is different things. So in Canada, when they talk about thick cover, it's maybe 50 meters of till over the top of their hard rock. But in Australia, maybe we would have 150 meters of weathering over the targets. And of course, some deposits are under very thick sequences of post-mineralization cover, hundreds of meters of post-mineralization cover. So the cover model is very important for geophysical interpretation. The cover typically has low density, low magnetic susceptibility, although there are exceptions, and then the electrical conductivity can be high or low depending on how much water and clay is in the unconsolidated cover. So we put together a cover model of the area by default because it affects a lot of the geophysical techniques or geophysical data sets that we deal with, and that cover model is derived from drilling, outcrop, and the geophysical interpretation. So we can use hard data like the drilled thickness of cover, or where we have basement rocks outcropping, as hard constraints on the depth of cover surface. So the geophysical methods that we use mostly are airborne electromagnetics, which is very effective certainly in Australia. The cover is generally electrically conductive, and you get a very nice. You can very estimate the thickness of the cover layer quite well from airborne EM data. You can use gravity data also to help you determine cover thickness. There are other techniques like passive seismic and even sometimes magnetics. So we generally try and use whatever we can get hold of, and even when it's not a hard constraint, we still will use it. So if some data set is suggesting cover is thicker in a particular location, we can build in that thickness increase into the model, even though we don't know the exact thickness. So this is a cover model derived from airborne electromagnetic data. We can quite clearly see this paleochannel network. This is from the southeast of Western Australia from memory. So that's just derived from like a two-layer inversion of airborne electromagnetic data with a conductive cover layer over resistive basement. And this section here, you can see this section cutting through the 3D model here. This just shows the starting model was just a simple two-layered case, and then the inversion was allowed to adjust the thickness of the cover to match the data. And you can see in this example, we've got cover thicknesses of up to about 90 meters, which isn't uncommon in Australian conditions. Just another example of one of the other data types we might use for cover thickness is sometimes we see magnetic drainages where magnemite, which forms as a result of weathering, gets concentrated in paleo channels, paleo drainages. And in this magnetic map on the left, you can see these dendritic features. So there's a main channel running along there and some tributary channels. So you can even use sometimes magnetic data to say, well, in these areas where we've got these quite strong channels, we might expect that we have maybe a few tens of meters thicker cover than in the other areas. And this picture on the right just shows the present day drainage in red. So these are the present day rivers and creeks, and in the the magnetic interpretation in black, and just showing that these things aren't coincident. If you look in this area here that I'm circling with the mouse at the moment, the magnetic feature is offset from the present drainage, so it's a paleo drainage. So that's quite common to see in Australian conditions as well, and dare say in other parts of the world. So petrophysical data is very important for forming the link between the geophysics and the geology. As I mentioned before, a common problem is that the data are often concentrated around the mineralization, and they don't adequately sample the host rock or the different alteration types that might be present in an area. And so this is something we're always battling against, is having enough regional petrophysical data to, properly constrain the interpretation. So quality control of that petrophysical data is very important. And a really common thing we come up against is that companies will have magnetic susceptibility databases, but when the data's been measured, the units haven't been recorded, or we don't know whether we're talking about SI times 10 to the minus 3 or times 10 to the minus 5. There's a mixture of data acquired with different instruments. Sometimes the units are recorded and they're not the units that used by a particular instrument, things like that. So, it can make a database completely unusable where the data hasn't been collected properly. It's also just, as a general bit of experience I picked up along the way, is just not to trust anything anyone gives you, and just spot check some of the other petrophysical data, like if you have densities measured using Archimedes' principle, to actually check the calculation and make sure that the final density that you've been given is realistic for the rock type it's meant to represent. And similarly, you can come up with issues related to calibration of geophysical logs that you're trying to use to constrain your data. So, all this quality control is very important. And my personal view is that when you have unreliable data, you're better off, getting rid of it and using the stuff you can trust. So the next step is to establish relationships between the geophysics and geology. That is just looking at the geophysical data and the geological maps and working out what units have distinct geophysical signatures, and you'll be able to model and represent properly in the 3D model. So where you have related units that have very similar petrophysical properties, there's no point in distinguishing them in the model if they can't be told apart on the basis of their petrophysical properties. So in that case, we just merge those units with similar properties in the model and simplify the model. You also, I've talked about this already, but you need to understand the petrophysics. There are some traps. We've done work in South America where they have a lot of ignimbrites where the densities are, less than 2 grams per cc for a lithified rock. It's quite uncommon in Australia, but it's pretty common in South America, and you can easily fall into the trap of interpreting solid rock as unconsolidated if you're not sort of aware of the of that type of problem. I've also come across in my own work clays. Normally in electromagnetic interpretation, we would assume that clays are going to be fairly conductive, something around 10 millisiemens per meter to 1,000 millisiemens per meter. But I have come across cases where they've been very resistive, very low water contents and very resistive. So there are traps even for sort of experienced geophysicists. And another one that we commonly ignore is anisotropy. And sometimes you do need to be aware that a unit is anisotropic and at least be aware of that, the effect that might have on your interpretation. So the first step of interpretation is to interpret contacts and structures from enhanced geophysical images, satellite imagery, the existing geological mapping. That's a fairly standard approach, and it's still we still do this more or less in 2D. But the idea is to move away from using the geophysics for direct detection of ore bodies to producing a geological model that's consistent with all the data that you have available. Part of that interpretation is to establish the timing of faults, which is important for targeting. So as part of the digitization, you can separate out the faults that you're interpreting into different ages or orientations. And then you start adding 3D information from structural, conventional structural dip and strike measurements, but also from modeling of geophysical data. So that can be interpretation, a dip of contacts based on magnetic modeling, or maybe from electromagnetic data. And this is just one example of getting structure from airborne EM data, where you can see a bunch of anomalies on this profile here. This is from the eastern goldfields of Western Australia. This kind of M-shaped anomaly where you have one peak that's smaller and another peak that's larger, and that asymmetry in the anomaly tells you the dip direction of the target that will be dipping in the direction of the larger peak, so as shown in this diagram here. So this type of data is very simple to interpret for dip, and even in big projects we don't even necessarily do this by modeling, but just by semi-quantitative estimation of the dip from the asymmetry of the profile. So we might look at that and say that looks like it's dipping at 45 degrees and this one looks like it's at 90 degrees. Very coarse kind of interpretation, but it still adds quite valuable structural information into the interpretation. And this is just one example. Again, this is the same area as the profile I just showed you, but just showing, this shows all the EM anomalies that were picked in this area. So it's quite a large area. It's roughly 10 by 10 kilometers. And you can see that some of these anomaly chains colored in blue are stratigraphic conductors. They're graphitic. They're not important in terms of direct detection. They're definitely not mineralization. They've got strike extents of several kilometers. But these are often the ones that it's possible to get a good estimate of dip on. And what I've shown in the 3D view on the right is we've just, for each anomaly, we've estimated a dip direction just by sort of visually, and we've made these structural tablets in the 3D software to display that information. And you can see, looking at this, that the tablets on the eastern side of this area are dipping to the west. So generally they're dipping to the west. So, or they're, a lot of them are very close to vertical, but generally the dips are to the west on the eastern side, and on the western side they're quite clearly dipping to the east. So we know in this case that we're looking at a synclinal structure. So that can be, quite useful structural information when you come to build a model. And this is an example from Mongolia, showing just different, this is for a porphyry copper exploration project, just showing the different data that went into the initial structural interpretation. So we had some magnetic data, we had ASTA satellite imagery, we had a couple of induced polarization and DC resistivity lines, and then some conventional geological mapping. And all those different data sets were interpreted and used to create a initial structural model. So you can see these faults are colored by because they have occurred at different geological times, and some of them have got dip information coming from interpretation of the magnetic and induced polarization data. So often when we're sort of doing the initial model building, if we don't know the dip and it's a highly deformed sort of metamorphic area, we'll just assume that the features and contacts and structures are all vertically dipping, and then we'll refine those dips by inversion, inversion of the geophysical data. But so quite a lot of effort goes into getting a good starting model, so that you get the better your starting model is, the better the result from your geologically constrained inversion will be. It's the model is a reasonable fit to the data before you start trying to run an inversion, and you get a much more satisfactory, geologically meaningful result. So this is just another example from the same Mongolian project where we're interpreting intrusions, and the data that went into it is the magnetics, a 3D inversion of the magnetic data, and geological mapping, and we came up with this 3D model of the possible intrusions in the area that ended up being incorporated in the final model. So geochemical data also plays a role in, it will tell you where you are in a system, whether you're proximal or distal to mineralization. In a porphyry system, it will, tell you the sort of what part of the system is presently exposed. It can tell you, where the fertile source rocks are. So it has quite a few contributions, and obviously also alteration mapping. So again, this is the same Mongolian project, and we have the samples in this view here coloured by the type of alteration. So potassic is blue, the blue dots, sodic is the green dots, and we got some phyllic alteration, which is the red symbols. So that information is also incorporated in the model, and your lithogeochemistry can help you, correctly position contacts that maybe don't have a very strong response in some of the geophysics. So the next step is 3D geologically constrained inversion, and that's to, put the final do the final revision of your model to make it consistent as much as possible with all of your geophysical model. So as I said before, a good starting model means you get a stable 3D inversion and a more geologically meaningful result. We usually do some sort of regional modeling and to sort of account for all the regional scale trends in the data, and then we embed that the local model inside that regional one, so that all the big long wavelength trends that can't be properly represented by the local model are accounted for by that regional model. With geologically constrained inversion, we start simple. We say all units have a homogeneous density and susceptibility. So each unit will have a distinct physical property, but we start off by assuming that that each unit is homogeneous, and then we see which parts of the model we can fit, which parts of the data we can fit with the model, sorry, and then which parts where we need to introduce more complexity into the model. So we often use the VP MG software for this kind of work, and that allows you to focus, have some units in your model that are heterogeneous and some which are homogeneous, and to allow certain units to change in your inversion, rather than the entire model, things like that. So some geological units might be very well represented by a homogeneous unit model, like a granite, which is fairly uniform in its geology, and you might have a quite well defined density and susceptibility, but other more complex geology certainly will require will need to be heterogeneous. So once this whole process is iterative, as I'll discuss on the next slide, but you keep kind of doing various attempts at this modelling and see where which data it agrees with and which data it disagrees with, and then keep trying, keep iterating through different models until you reach a final model which hopefully is in pretty good agreement with all of your constraining data at the scale that you're interested in. So, and once you've done that, and you can look at the misfit between the observed data and the response of the model, and that will tell you where you have either some problem with your model, so the geometry might be wrong, or you might have the physical properties wrong, or you might be highlighting a genuinely anomalous area, which is interesting from an exploration viewpoint. It could be alteration or mineralization. So that's sort of how we use 3D geologically constrained inversion in this process. And this slide just illustrates the process. You might start, have a geological starting model, which is conceptual and shows the basic elements that you think are in an area. You might need to modify that model. You almost certainly will need to modify that model to make it agree with the geophysics. But you might be, the geophysicist might introduce some things that the geologist doesn't like. So, there's another refinement to make the geologist happy. But, that might require physical properties that just aren't in what you see in your data. So then more and more variations of the model until you finally arrive at a model that's acceptable geologically, geophysically, and petrophysically. And you could add geochemically there as well. But it's an iterative process, and it takes quite a while. It can take quite a while, and the more detail you want in your model, the longer that process takes, and the more expensive it is. But my opinion would be that it's well worth the effort. Your final model, your aim is to be consistent with the fact data that you have, which is outcrop and drilling, and with all your different kinds of geophysical data. And mostly with the 3D geophysical modeling, we're mostly using gravity and magnetics because we can run 3D models for those kinds of data in a reasonable time frame. But at a local scale, you might also include quite complicated interpretations of IP data or EM. The model that you end up with is a snapshot in time. So it's just the model that agrees with all the data that you have at that point in time, and it should be reviewed and updated as more information becomes available. So if there's another geophysical data set is acquired over the area, and you might find that suddenly your model doesn't agree that well with the new geophysical data, then you need to go back and do some more revisions to it. But that's not as, once you've gone to the effort of setting up the model in the first place, and you've got a starting framework, that's not as big a deal as starting from scratch. So the final model provides a framework for just general geological interpretation and exploration, but also for quantitative targeting, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end of this talk. So this is an example of a project from Kapushi in Zambia that we did for First Quantum Minerals, and just showing you the input data set. So this was an area that had quite a reasonable geological map shown at the bottom left. We had a few, a bit of petrophysical information. It wasn't exactly from this project, but from similar lithologies. And we had, a few drill holes, but not very many. This the scale of this is something like 10 by 10 kilometers as well. It's quite a reasonably sized area. It's not many drill holes over that size of area. And the geophysical data sets to support it were the magnetics up at the top left. There was some pretty shallow airborne EM. It didn't have, it was time domain, but it had very short off times. So it was quite a high base frequency for the EM, and then the gravity data. So you can see, just looking at these three data sets, that they're very complementary to one another. They're showing different features within the area of interest, and we find that these are a very powerful combination to do geological interpretation from geophysics. If you have magnetics and gravity, or airborne gravity radiometry and airborne EM with a reasonable modern system, you can put together a lot of information about the geology and build, quite a good 3D model, even when you don't have that much geological control. So these were sort of the starting data sets for the Kapushi exercise, and this is what we ended up with. We ended up with a 3D geological model. We ended up with a cover model. So this is the basic weathering surface, just displayed as a grid. And then these two slides at the bottom show the geologically constrained magnetic susceptibility model and density model. So, and local features within these models are the things that might be of exploration interest. So, and I just want to show you this. On the left is the initial 2D geological model that we started with, and on the right is the final 3D model from the integrated interpretation. And just showing you that there's more detail in the geophysical model than in the, or there are units in the geophysical model, this final 3D model here, that don't exist in the original geological model, because these, say this thin unit here running around the edge of this fold, and this purple one here are not represented in they've all been mapped as a single unit in the geological map, but they have distinct geophysical signatures, and so they can be represented in the model. And these were obviously good marker horizons for the interpretation. So we've gone from 2D to 3D in this exercise, and this model is basically consistent with all the different input data sets that we had available. So we then come to the uses of the model. Obviously one that's very interesting is targeting. And to do targeting, firstly, you need to work out what your geological criteria are, what geologically, what are you looking for? And then you have to decide how you can represent those geological criteria in some sense, numerical form that can be, represented in or they can be given to, say, a machine learning algorithm or something like that. So this process of deciding the criteria and working out how to represent them numerically is very, very important. And for our targeting exercises, we use fairly conventional methods like weights of evidence and index overlay, but also sometimes machine learning approaches, and particularly we use random forest a fair bit. So this is just an example of this this targeting, deciding your exploration criteria, and this is a porphyry copper example, but just showing the different types of targets that might exist. We have near surface vein and stockwork, which is shown in yellow here and associated with these structures that are shown by the dotted lines. We have near surface disseminated stockwork and copper gold targets. That's this light blue zone highlighted by the light blue line, sort of draped over here. We have then, other disseminated and stockwork copper gold targets, which are shown in the darker blue, and then you have skarn deposits in the carbonate units around the main intrusion. So the criteria that you might use to find this type of mineralization are just anomalous copper, gold, and molybdenum from your geochemical data. You might have chargeability. So that's the chargeability from the IP can help you define different types of alterations. So this is the philic alteration zone is shown in blue here. So the IP responds to that. It also can show you the potassic alteration and other parts of the system. The components that we have contributing structures, geological components are the structures shown by the dashed lines, the porphyry itself, which is the red area, the pluton, which is the source of heat and fluids and everything at depth, a zone of potassic alteration in purple, philic alteration in light blue, and propylitic alteration, which is this big green zone around the whole whole thing. So this is just one example, but you could build this up for any type of deposit. And then this is the process. This is illustrating the process of going from the geological targeting criteria to how they might represented in the 3D model so that we can use them for targeting. So something like anomalous copper, gold, and molybdenum. What is that? That's copper greater than 124 ppm, gold greater than 5 ppb, molybdenum anomalies. The data that we might use to define that is soil geochemistry, rock chip geochemistry, and mobile metal ion work. And how we represent it in the model is just maybe polygons, surrounding areas which are high in these particular elements. So you go through that process for all the different things. You're, for defining the major intrusion at depth, the precursor intrusion, you might use your magnetic gravity, magnetotelluric data, and your regional geology. And that intrusion will be represented in the model as a 3D wireframe. So you go through all the different criteria, and there are a lot here, because there's another page. So saying what the geological criteria are, how they might, what geological, geophysical, and geochemical methods you might use to define those things in the model, and then how they're actually going to be represented in the model. And you can do the targeting exercise in 2D or 3D. This is that same Mongolian porphyry project that I showed a couple of slides from earlier, where the different coloured polygons in here just show the areas that are prospective for different kind of targets. So this is from putting together all those different targeting criteria and using, in this case, it was a weights of evidence approach to come up with this target map. And so you're seeing all these zones that are prospective for different styles of mineralization. So the skarn in pink and the buried disseminated stockwork copper gold in blue, etc. So you can do this in 3D if you have, it's a little bit more effort, but certainly also possible in 3D. And this is just an example from the Vermelhos deposit in Brazil, in the Curaçao Valley in Brazil, where they had, some interesting drill holes with some mineralization in them. They developed a prospectivity model using a lot of geophysical data, including downhole EM, which was responding to some of the particular mineralization, and from that targeting exercise, these are the results of the 3D weights of evidence targeting exercise, showing a prospective zone here and a deeper one here. So this was based on all the different geophysical data that they had available mainly, and both of those targets were verified by later drilling. So there was, a borehole EM plate target up here, which was below the current workings, that sat within this this area defined here, and that targeting exercise also defined this deeper area, which was also later verified by drilling. So quite reasonable percentages of copper in some of these holes at quite large depth. So we also, are increasingly using doing the mineral prospectivity using machine learning approaches, and we use random forests a lot. So it's a classification. You give it a learning data set where you have some known mineralization and the associated exploration vectors that you develop from your targeting exercise, and you train the algorithm on that learning set and then apply it to the rest of your area, and it will try and predict similar signatures from the data. And what you end up with is a 2D or 3D prospectivity model. This, again, is from this same area in South America, in the Curaçao Valley, where this is a MPI as Mineral Potential Index. So this is just showing the output from the machine learning exercise, where areas coloured in red here are highly prospective for Vermelhos style mineralisation. And this shows all this panel on the right shows all the different criteria that went into making this image. So there are sort of roughly 40 of them in this case, maybe slightly more, and just showing this is what the sort of height of the bars on this graph, or how far they extend to the right, shows how important the random forest algorithm thinks these different criteria are to the interpretation. So some things that we thought were really important, and we expected to come out with being considered to be really important by the algorithm, it came out with almost no importance. You've got a couple of criteria here that are very low importance or no importance to the ability to predict the mineralization. So it's kind of useful in that regard, and you can run this with you might have this is a very quite a large area that we're looking at here. It's 30 kilometers east-west and then 130 kilometers north-south, and there are several different styles of mineralization in there, and this was using training it on all the different kinds of mineralization and using all of these different criteria to try and predict the mineralization. But you can also just use examples from one deposit type, and you can use various different subsets of the different criteria. So one thing that's often interesting to do is to, if you put drill hole geochemistry into something like this, you often end up with a lot of things around where you have drilling and not much further away. So you can do a run that excludes the drilling data and see how that's different from a run that includes it, and exercises like that. So and we use it for a lot of different things. We use just attempt to predict alteration just based on the geophysics, and the reason being that the alteration data is very localized around the drill holes normally, but the geophysical data sets generally have very good coverage of these areas. And if you are able to predict some kinds of alteration using the geophysics, then you can massively extend your coverage of the area. So just to summarize, I've just got a couple of slides. The fundamental aim of integrated interpretation of geological and geophysical data is to develop a model that's consistent with your sort of geological conception of the area and quantitatively consistent with all the data that you have available. Our experience is that you get a better model using this approach than you would if you just interpreted each of the data sets individually. So by modelling them all simultaneously, you end up with a more geologically realistic final model, even though there are still issues of non-uniqueness and such that you have to be aware of. But to do this, you really need to understand the relationships between your geology and the geophysical responses and rock properties. And just some thoughts. You should have a well-defined objective. What is the geological question or questions that you're trying to answer? You need a multidisciplinary team to do this kind of work. You need to have geologists and geophysicists and geochemists on the project who really understand the different kinds of data they are dealing with. So we have specialists sometimes in different methods or different deposit types that we bring into projects. You can do this kind of interpretation at any scale. The level of detail that you get depends on your budget. Very, very detailed modelling, then that requires more time. And the model that you get is, a framework for future exploration and targeting exercises, and it needs to be, or it should be, updated as new information becomes available. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to take some questions. And I hope you found it.
Thanks, James. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, James. It was really interesting presentation, and especially integrating the various data sets and the kind of. Thanks, James. It was really interesting presentation. It could clarify, at least for myself, I could learn a couple of things which I was not clear about. I leave the questions forum. Anybody if has questions, please unmute their mic and can ask. Yeah, Dhananjay, to start with, please go ahead.
Yeah, it was nice to listen, James. It was interesting. What I see is that you have been using the geophysical data with resistivity, gravity, and other. But only the issue is that when we make up a 3D model, there is always a issue of modeling the depths. Where if you take resistivity modeling, there is a difference in some error is there. If you take up a model of gravity and calculated depth, there would be an error. If you take even seismic data available, even then there would be an error. Now, when we make up a 3D model for a realistic understanding, how do you manage this? And how much amount of error gets in?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's obviously non-uniqueness in the interpretation, and I think you can reduce it by incorporating lots of different data types, because some things that are required, some things will quite clearly say that the model geometry has to be one particular, the things have to be dipping in one direction, say, and not the other, and that's a very useful constraint on the interpretation of the potential fields, which are highly non-unique. So there's still what we would try and do is build up a starting model that is in agreement with the sort of geological concept of the area, and fill it with petrophysical properties, from whatever information we have. And then I didn't really show this step, but then the first step is just to compute the response of that model and see where it fits the data well and where it doesn't. And so, if your geological concept is pretty good, you might get a pretty reasonable fit between your observed and calculated model from the start, and then we wouldn't do anything. We'd kind of say, well, it looks like, this idea about the geometry of the model is fine, and there might be very slight adjustments to the depths of units and things like that from the interpretation. But it's a different way of imparting the depth information to the model. Yeah. So I agree with what you're saying, and there's obviously this uncertainty, and that's why we always say, as you collect more data, that you need to go back and revise it. It's an interpretation. It's not hard fact. But we feel like you're reducing some of the uncertainty by modeling several different data types together and getting, if the model is consistent with a lot of your data, then it's more likely to be a reasonable model.
James, I just wanted to know what is the quantitative error, whether it is about, you go up to 50 meters depth error or 10 meters or 100 meters, what is that depth error? That is what I wanted to understand. That, how much error is getting in?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think some parts of the models could be, have quite large errors, and others would be be quite small. So maybe your depth of cover interpreted from airborne electromagnetics, might be good to plus or minus 5 meters. Your depth to an intrusion from potential fields interpretation, particularly if you don't know your petrophysical properties well, could be, hundreds of meters, especially, if it's at reasonable depth. But so, I hope that answers your question. We're well aware that we have errors in the model. We think we're doing better than we would do with just individual interpretations than.
James, just to add to what James has said, basically he was explaining us how a cover model, a basic startup model can be done, and then we can add constraints to make ourselves more comfortable. Questions of specific nature of depth, what Dhananjay sir was inquiring about, that would also depend on the data density and the data quality. If you're looking at a regional scale, probably if you're looking at a basin studies, that's a different issue. But if you're looking at primarily if you're looking at, say, a mineral deposit which is very close, could be different. I have another question which has come in the chat box, James. It says, thanks for the presentation. I have one query on MI, that is machine learning, ML, sorry, is a random forest is only model used or other models are run and the best fit model is being chosen, or random forest is the best model is shown in the accuracy scores in your model. So his primary question is, do you run other models also, or is it just the random model which over a period you have experienced as the best one?
Yeah, we're not I'm not a specialist in machine learning, so but we do use other algorithms as well. But the guy that put a couple of those examples together, he likes random forest because he thinks it's quite it's less sensitive to noisy input than some other machine learning algorithms. But yeah, we've used a lot of different things in the past, and it's sort of the individual specialization of the people involved on different projects determines what we use. But yeah, and I think the main issue with that is really putting in some reasonable or developing good targeting vectors from your data to be to use in the machine learning approach. They say rubbish in, rubbish out. So really paying a lot of attention to how you define those vectors and realize, turn them into, find some sort of numerical representation of them.
This is another question from Shailendra. He says, can you share any stories of failures?
Well, we sorry about that. They'd be the clients you never hear back from again. But we have a lot of.
James, do you hear me?
Yeah, Shailendra, go ahead.
James, good afternoon. Sorry, it's a bit. I didn't want to. Get a kind of confusion. Why I'm coming from this question is that even in Rio, when we were exploring many deposits, we have failed. And the story of success, like Vinu, the copper, recently is one which comes in 7 and 8 years. So just we wanted to predict ourselves. Where do we just go do mistakes from a person like you with a vast experience? Any in your lifetime, maybe sometimes somewhere we might have done some. Because success stories are very rare. So what mistakes usually we do when we just, because I understand, like, as you said in your presentation, it needs subject matter experts, various communities and various domain experts all should sit together and just do this. But however, when we really do it, we have some failures. So I would like to hear from you.
Yeah. Look, we certainly have failures, and there are, like I said, even simple traps in interpretation that, if you're not aware of, on the, if the geophysical response of a certain unit isn't what you think it is, you can get the interpretation completely wrong. And all I can say is, like, I guess, we almost certainly have had our failures, but we've had, some good successes as well. And a lot of it has been brownfields exploration around existing mines. So, where there is a lot of data and, you're better able to make a prediction maybe in those cases. But we're sort of limited in what cases we're allowed to show, and often the successful ones, that companies are sort of sensitive about releasing that kind of information often. So, I have a couple in mind that were very good, where the results were, very good, and the clients are extremely happy because they found more mineralization, but unfortunately we're not allowed to show them. But, there are a lot of, and quite commonly we go, we had one project that we worked on where the client told us that the structure in the area, the big structure in the area we were looking at, was a anticline, and they'd put that in lots of internal reports and things like that, and we did a lot of modeling, and we managed to get a fit to the gravity and magnetic data with an anticline model. But then we started to put together more information, and the airborne EM was really inconsistent with the potential fields and geological interpretation. So it's a covered area, so there wasn't really much geological information. So you can't sort of blame them for maybe getting it wrong. But in the end, we to make it consistent with everything, we had to turn that whole structure from an anticline into a syncline, and then we could get a model that honoured all the different kinds of data, and totally, upturned their exploration model. They drilled a lot of holes, but they ended up drilling down deep because they had the whole sort of fold upside down. And, when we went back and looked at how they'd come up with this anticline model, it was in a report from a consultant from 15 years ago. It had been cut and pasted from that report into other reports, and it just had become accepted fact, without being questioned. So, without anyone actually going back and rechecking the original data to see if it was, the most likely situation. And they had all this data. They just no one had ever sat down, or no sort of multidisciplinary team had sat down and looked at the data and, put it all together. And it really made a difference in that example. So I can understand how it happens, because those, some of those companies have very high turnover of staff, and that particular project had something like 10 geologists responsible for it in the previous 5 years, and probably only a couple of them actually went out there and actually set foot on the ground. So, companies can lose a lot of information when people leave and move to other companies. And it really, what it taught us is that you have to go back and question look at the data for yourself and draw your own conclusion from it. Sorry, because, you can be, it can be misleading just to take, whatever you're told for granted. So I think, I think a lot of the times that the issue with, is sometimes, data is looked at very, pretty quickly. There are real time pressures for exploration, and maybe you don't get a chance to sit down and really look at it and try and see how it all fits together until, maybe years down the track. And it takes an appropriate group of people to be able to do that, like with all the skills required. And we don't do it perfectly because we don't have everyone in every room. We're scattered around the world, and we'll share projects online and talk about them, but it's not the same as having everyone in one office that really invested in that project.
Sorry, James. Shubhendu, you had a couple of questions. You can shoot, Shubhendu.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, for your permission. And sir, I really like to express my feelings for this informative and fabulous presentation to James, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. And I have learned a lot from your expertise and for these. But sir, I have some observation, as I have also worked in prospectivity mapping for mineral exploration using MLA. So I think that, sir, in case of any study area which is structurally controlled, their lineament density map can play a better role in case of prospectivity mapping. And in the second, I think that random forest is okay, sir. I have also applied support vector machine and convolutional neural network, which have given good result too.
Yeah.
And third thing is that, sir, here remote sensing also can play a better role in spectral mapping to target the host rock and the country rock and the boundary to modify the lithology of any study place. And second is that, sir, I think that if we are talking about machine learning approach, I think that in that case, the number of input layers can play an important role. So how many number of constraint we are putting there, it also important. So that, sir, if you please tell me about the role of that, I will be happy. And second is that you have talked about applying weights. Sir, it can be knowledge driven and it can be data driven, which can be better. And third is that, sir, if we are talking about a model, there come two things. First is depth resolution. I think that Dhananjay sir has already mentioned that. So, and second is that the specific location, I mean that spatial distance resolution. So, sir, in that case, we can make more accurate model based on different algorithm, maybe some hybrid inversion algorithm, and some new approach. And as no model is absolute, so we can make a different I think that we should make a pilot study to test our first derived model to check the validity. Then we can apply for the final version. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, look, I think that was a lot of questions and comments, but I think I agreed with a lot of them. I'm not, advocating one particular kind of machine learning algorithm over another. We have used random forest for a lot of work recently. One thing I guess I didn't mention is that when we have all those targeting criteria, we run different scenarios using different subsets of those criteria. So we won't, even if there are 40 or 50, we will also run targeting studies using, say, just the ones from the geophysical data, or just the, I did mention leaving out the drilling information from your targeting exercise to try and get it to look for things away from the known mineralization. So, you know, I agree with a lot of those. My comment on the, you know, the depth uncertainty in the model is that, unfortunately, the geophysics is the only way of getting depth information away from the drilling. Really, I mean, you can have some concepts, but that's the only. So we have to accept the uncertainty that we've got from the geophysical interpretation in terms of depth. And you can, you know, a geologically constrained geophysical model looks vastly different to an unconstrained model. We basically don't use unconstrained modeling much anymore. It's a transformation of the observed data from, say, nanotesla to susceptibility, but it's not, you know, you're limited in what you can interpret from that kind of model. And, you know, I certainly agreed with your comment on the remote sensing that it can be very valuable depending on where you are in the world. It, you know, it often doesn't contribute much in Australia because a lot of stuff is undercover. But, you know, we certainly use it when it's available. I would use any data set that was available, depending on where I was. You know, there's information from all these different kinds of data that can all be included in the model. So.
James, last question. I mean, one question which is Dr. Shivkumar has raised is that how 3D model output is verified with the field data. That's what Dr. Shivkumar sir wanted to know. And I will also allow this last question from Dr. Manjari. Dr. Manjari sir, you can speak about it, about your question, and with these two questions, I think there are a lot of other questions which may come, but they can write email and we can clarify them.
Sure. Yeah.
Dr. Manjari, please go ahead with your question or suggestion, whatever you wanted to speak.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sir. So good afternoon, sir. James, sir. Sir, my question is, how can be borehole geological data can be integrated in 3D modeling?
Well, we use it to. This is borehole geophysical data or geological data? Sorry.
Geological data, basically.
Geological, yeah. So, you know, you can constrain the geophysical models by the pierce points from drill holes, so that you can have a surface in your model that will be allowed to change in the geophysical inversion, but where it's been drilled,
Okay.
it won't be allowed to change. So that's you know, a feature of the software that we have. You know, the commercially available software that we can use routinely. So that's the VPMG software that allows explicit incorporation of geological constraints. Otherwise, with the UBC style models, you have to give it a reference model which is geologically based, and sort of take a 3D geological model and transform that into a set of you know, effectively weights that try and force the model to honour the geological boundaries that you know about. So so that's one way, but we would also look at, you know, we look at alteration logs and all sorts of things, and to try and pin down where contacts are, and building. This is building the initial model. We would use as much information from drilling and lithogeochemistry as we can, and then what you see is when you compare the response of that initial model with the data, you see where there are problems with the geometry or the physical properties. And then when you run the inversion, you see things happening like susceptibility, say in a magnetic model, piling up against an interface. In the model, it sort of implies that there's a problem with the geometry, and the contact that you've got in your model should be in a different place. So you get clues from the actual behavior of the inversion, as well as you know, as well as from hard information. So
thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
No
Thank you,
problems.
sir.
No problems.
Thanks.
I thank all the participants because
Yeah, thank you, James, once again, and thank you all the participants for
Yeah.
attending. And James, it was very enriching, very knowledgeable. And there are a lot of more questions which are in the chat box. We'll email it to you if you can reply. And also, I'm requesting other participants if they have any more questions, they can write to us. We'll get the answer from James and share it with you. So just before we close,
sir, please send the sir mail ID, and sir, if I can, sir, actually, sir, if I have something to.
If you'll put some your email ID, we'll put your our. No problem.
So we are sharing the email ID in the chat box. We are sharing the email ID in the chat box right now, so you can share it on this email ID.
Yes.
And so before we close, like just about the next PIP that we'll be having, it will be by Dr. Abani Samal. He's an expert in minerals estimation and advanced geostatistics and mining domain. So his topic would be financing and exploration project and what do the financial institutions look for. So we'll be sharing the details of this also on our LinkedIn page and all the social media site. So James, thank you once again for today.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks
everyone for attending.
James, my personal thanks to you for taking out your time on a weekend. I really appreciate, and we have been really, feel grateful for this gesture. And friends, all of this, we continue on every third Saturday of the month. And Dr. Abani Samal is also a consultant with World Bank. So hearing with him about financial models and what financial institutes look for would be an interesting topic to join for. Thank you, one and all. Thank you, James, once again.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's an honor. Thank you.